Don't build boring content. That is the last thing that you want to do. And that is why this week I am having Emily Aborn on as our guest. She is the host of the Content with Character podcast, and she helps turn your ideas into content that people actually want to hear about. When it comes to content marketing, she is definitely enthusiastic. She's effective. And as you're going to see here, she is also very energetic. Those are the reasons why I am excited to talk to her. Stay tuned. Emily, thank you for coming on. I really appreciate it. I am so glad to have you here. You mentioned that you, kind of hid behind your message with or hid behind your guests with the She Built This podcast that you did before. What was that experience like? And then what prompted you to say, look, I'm going to change this. And now with Content with Character, it's a very different format. So what prompted you to be like, look, I'm going to change this and I'm going to take this giant leap forward?
Thanks for having me, Josh. First and foremost, I'm excited to have this conversation. And I guess we're just getting right into it.
Oh, definitely.
Okay, so She Built This, the podcast started in 2019. And basically, I had just wanted to have a podcast my entire life. Like, I was the 6-year-old who would do like cooking shows on the tape recorder at her house. And trust me, nobody wanted to listen to me like teach them how to make egg salad sandwiches. So when I finally when I started She Built This, it was just because I always had that desire inside of me to like do a podcast or do radio, something like that. So I started it kind of like not knowing what I was doing, but I wanted to bring the voices of other women entrepreneurs to life through my podcast and like their stories and things like that. So that's how I started it, kind of no rhyme or reason. And it sort of bloomed from there into events, into peer groups, into like a whole community. I had like a membership program associated with it. So it was like a whole entire thing. It was actually a second business of mine. Well, at the same time, I was over there like building my copywriting business. Okay. And I was putting 110% into both things. So I had to make the decision. Like I realized, first of all, the podcast itself was very time consuming for me. I like you, I take a lot of time to prepare and like research about my guest. And like, it just took a lot of my time. I was editing it by myself. I was doing all of the things by myself. And I also was never really bringing up to anyone the fact that I was a copywriter. So it was just kind of like a lot of people in my community didn't even actually know what I did. They're just like, oh, Emily's so nice running this group for us. So I was using, if I reflect on it, I think I was using it to kind of like hide the fact that I was scared to say what I really did, like a little bit of that imposter syndrome, if you will. So I had a strategy session with a podcast strategist, and she was like helping me with my podcast and looking through it. And she's like, what I see is two options here. You can either totally rebrand your show and change it to kind of like focus more on the content and the copywriting and the marketing so that it aligns with your other business and still bring on guests and still kind of do it that way. Or you could start a second show. And I looked at her and I'm like, I'm not starting a second show. Like, that's ridiculous. But I
can barely do the first one.
Exactly. But of course, I couldn't stop thinking about it. And like here in New Hampshire, we get a ton of snow. I'm like out there one day in a snowstorm, like shoveling. I mean, no joke, it was like 40 inches. And I'm shoveling the snow and I'm like, I'm going to do it. I'm going to start this second podcast. And it's going to be something about like character build or like infusing character into like what we do. And lo and behold, Content with Character was born. So the breadcrumb trail there is just like I reduced my frequency on She Built This. And then I reduced it a little bit more. And then I reduced it a little bit more. And I was like, I don't want to do this anymore. I just want to focus. I'm such a, I don't like to have my attention split in too many directions. I like to just focus on things that I'm doing in my life. So that was my decision to kind of shut that down and pivot into my own. And I will say that doing a solo cast is my decision was twofold. One, I think I was a little burnt out on guests. Like that was just like, I'm done. And I love being a guest on other people's shows. So I still kind of get that, like that energy.
That conversation.
Yes, exactly. And then two, I just had a lot of ideas. Like I have like a list of like 300 ideas for that podcast. So I'm not like running out of ideas anytime soon. I just have a lot of things I want to talk about. So for right now, it is a solo episode until that idea list runs dry and I need help.
It's so interesting. So you've got a list of 300 ideas to pull from that you're going to talk about.
Yes.
To me, that's amazing because a lot of the things that we talk about, like we see pod fade all the time.
All the time.
Yes. People like, I want to get out. I want to talk about it. And they start with, I mean, they may not start with cooking classes, but they start with this idea of like, hey, I want to speak to people. And then they come out guns blazing and they get to episode 12 and they're like, crap, what am I going to talk about next? And suddenly they lose that. The ideas that you're getting, do you have a running list that you're keeping? Are they just in your head? How are you keeping track of all this?
I actually do have a Google Doc, and I'll add to it like based on if I just have an idea, I'll put it in that Google Doc. And also if like a client asks me questions or you sent me questions ahead of time that were like so good. So I will take every single one of those questions and a lot of those will become ideas for a podcast episode. So I use like a lot of inspiration from just what I'm doing in my everyday. Or if I bump into the same issue all the time in my workday, I'm like, oh, I bet other people are coming up against this too. So
if you've seen it a couple of times, you're like, I got to talk about this.
Exactly.
Love that. From that, I mean, with you having done the podcast over a number of years now, let's say two of the biggest lessons that you've gotten from podcasting that maybe you've applied someplace else?
Okay. One is that a collaboration like what you and I are doing right now, whether you have your own podcast and you're bringing on guests or whether you're going on other people's podcasts and being their guests, I feel like the possibilities are absolutely endless. And I don't mean to just sound like vague with that. I have met my best friends through podcasting. I have done events and collaborated with people on like other avenues, like other money-making avenues from podcasting. And I've just like expanded what I know in like my own knowledge base so much through podcasting. So that's, I think, my biggest takeaway. I know you asked for two, but I think that one has been a really, really big one for me. There's a lot of power in podcasting. And I think the other thing is like, it really gives you a chance to share your message, but also like refine your message. So as you get better at saying what you believe and what you think again and again and again, you really start to refine it. Like, what do I really think about that?
Sure. And we'll give you that because it's a big enough one thing that it sits on the scale for two, for sure. I totally see that. With that, you kind of mentioned listening to the audience's needs and hearing the struggles and pulling content from that. What are the ways, like, I know you said if you hear that problem, are you actively listening for those problems that you hear two or three times? Is it something where you're consciously making this effort to say, look, I think that's going to be a podcast? Or are you actively looking to say, where are the podcasts in this conversation?
I think I'm actively looking to say where are the
Sure.
podcasts in this conversation, but probably a lot of it is like post reflection. You know what I mean? Like I might not do that right now while you and I are talking because my brain will be very distracted. But then afterwards, I might be like, "Ooh, that was a great question. I'm going to turn that into an episode." And specifically, I think where I'm looking for it is like if I do a presentation or a workshop and the audience asks me a question, some of the questions people ask you in those things are just like fantastic. Or
Yes.
my friends like to text me their questions, right? They're like, can I pick your brain? I'm like, sure, go ahead. So what are they picking my brain about? Like things like that. And then of course, like in my client calls, I think that's like the hot spot if you work with one-on-one clients to pull out what their questions are. And I also listen to a ton of podcasts. I love listening to other podcasters and like hear what their opinion is. And if I hear one and I'm like, oh, I disagree, then I like lean into that. Like, well, why do I disagree? disagree. What do I think about it? And try to pull something out of that.
Interesting. I love that. Your business is largely built on content creation now in terms of largely written word, correct?
Yes, I'm like a copywriter, and that's like 90% of my business.
So with that, you often advocate, I can't talk today. You often advocate simplicity and clarity, the two things that I am not good at right this second. That being said, how can businesses like simplify their message without making it too simple? Or what's a way that they can simplify it and make sure that it's still effective?
Okay, you're not giving yourself enough credit, first of all, because you're not being complicated at all. And I think first and foremost is like kind of what we're doing right now, which is to think, well, remembering that like one person is on the other side of the screen, one person is on the other side of the podcast. So I really want to make it conversational and like it's speaking to them. And I think what a lot of people do that does complicate it is they're like, oh, I'm going to speak to everybody. And they kind of do. They address everybody. And it's like, just focus on one. Like I like to, before I record a podcast, I'll like think about one person I know is listening. And it doesn't matter that I'm not going to like reference them often. I just think about them, and I like to make it like I'm having a conversation with that one person. And I get a lot of good feedback on that piece. So I try to say like, even in our copy, we can like be very conversational. And I think the second one is not to complicate things, which I also see this all the time. We like to tell people like all the features of what they're going to get. Right? Like you're going to get a 90-minute call, and you're going to get 6 weeks of coaching, and you're going to get turn it into how it matters and like actually benefits them. Like, why do they care? So because if you just compare features to features, you are like everybody else that does exactly what you do. But if you turn that into like emotional benefits and like benefits as to how that's going to change somebody's life, that's how you stand out. And then it also takes out that urge to like, I want to do all this jargony, complex language and explain the ins and outs of a Rodecaster microphone, which nobody wants to know. No.
It's so funny because I always talk like to people as they're a guest. If someone asks a question, I always say yes or no first. So many people give the explanation and then never really answer the question. We find that in so many cases, and I see that when people are, once again, they make it too complex. They're showing off these features. Well, I don't care about the features. Show me how I actually am going to reap the rewards of doing this as the client. I love that point. That kind of goes into, like you've talked about the importance of, when it comes to podcasting, putting the listener first. Pick that one person. Do you know of any businesses that you can think of that would be like larger businesses that you think they do a great job of prioritizing like that one person in their audience?
I think Apple does a pretty good. Oh, you know what? I'm going to do an even better example than Apple because everybody uses Apple. Have you seen those new Airbnb commercials?
Yes.
Okay, they are doing it right. They get it. They get that booking a hotel room, it's great in theory. It's always so great in theory to book a hotel room, but you get into the hotel room and the pillows are uncomfortable and the toilet doesn't work and it's not as clean as you thought it was going to be and the key doesn't work. Like whatever the thing is, right? You have to switch rooms. The housekeeper comes in too early in the morning. They do such a good job at showing you the difference between booking a hotel and booking an Airbnb where everybody's written these reviews and you know what you're getting. They nailed it. And they know deeply, they understand like somebody who wants to travel, but they like get all of the hassle therein. So that's a person, they take a persona every single time and break down that persona. And I think they do a great job.
Yeah, no, I agree with you on that one. That one's been an interesting one. And it's been an interesting, campaign that they have put out from that aspect, because it's really going after the jugular, so to say.
Yes.
No holds barred. We're going to show the ugly side of this, and go ahead and make up your mind from there. I agree with that. You talked about, too, the success of your How to Write About Yourself episode. You said everyone likes to talk about themselves, but they don't really know how. And I'll agree with me on that one. People are like, hey, can you give me your bio? And I'm like, I'm just me.
Yeah.
Not terribly. I'm like, I do podcasts, I kind of ride motors, some of that stuff. You solved a big problem for people on that. Where did that idea come from? Did that come from people talking about that?
Yeah, people ask me all the time. Well, I have a service called the Bio Builder, and I get a lot of. It's a quick service. I'll turn it around, and within a week, and somebody will get 3 versions of their bio. And so what I was seeing time and time again is that the bios people would show me were like, I'm like, oh my gosh, I've read them too as a host. They're just not interesting bios. And what I will do as a podcast listener is like, if I can tell the bio is just like more jargon, I just fast forward. If it's a word salad, I'm like 30 seconds, right? So I want to help people like kind of avoid that by making them a little bit more interesting. And I am definitely not saying mine is the best in the world, because I know for a fact, like I haven't looked at my own in a while, but I think one easy thing is to remember that like a host is reading it in most cases, and it's like the audience is like first encounter with you. So
Sure.
You don't even have to start it like Emily Aborn is a copywriter, blah, 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 blah. I could start it with something way more interesting. Like, that blinking cursor that you're staring at every single day and can't figure out what to write or say. I help you solve that problem, or our guest today helps you solve that problem, right? So you can just think of little tiny ways to make it a little more interesting, because a bio is the most boring thing in the world, and no one cares until they know why you care. I mean, that's not my own saying.
I wholeheartedly agree with that. It's the same. The flip side of that, too, is the other part is I also tell people that you never let a doctor introduce themselves on a podcast.
Right.
If you have a 20-minute podcast, exactly. You will be 16 minutes in and they have just arrived at their residency. Cover the highlights, make it interesting, say why the heck they're here, and yes. get on with your, totally agree with that. You're a big fan of repurposing content. That's a whole reason why we kind of have the podcast studios in that here. You've referred to the long form first and then the social first approaches to content. Are those different? And can you give me that differentiation between those?
Sure. Yeah. So let's stay out of the jargon, right? Just for going back to what we just talked about. So long form would be like a podcast episode or a blog or even an email newsletter, depending on how wordy you are. Mine are long form. I'm sure you're not surprised. So that's like an example of long form. And the one when you're repurposing it, which means making it into something new, not just copying and pasting. Sometimes copying and pasting works, but it doesn't always directly translate. So you can take those longer pieces and break them down into smaller pieces and use them in other ways. Like social media is a great example. Mini video clips is a great example, right? Like reels, short stories, things like that. The other approach is like the person that doesn't do the long form, which is totally fine. But they're like, oh, but I really want to have a blog. I really want to have a workbook. I really want to have an ebook. I want to have a podcast, et cetera, et cetera. I say go through your social media and find your themes. So find something that you've talked about at least 10 times and then take all those posts and turn them into something longer. So a lot of people will, without knowing it, they're like, oh, I just gave them 10 tips on this one topic area, but they didn't even realize it, right? They're just like, no, I'm just making a post. So go back and find all those like themes and just group them together. And there you go. Now you have a piece of long form content.
You've talked about, too, taking your podcast stuff, turning that into blog posts in terms of that written form. I know that is a large part of what you do, but are there some basic tips that get someone to like, okay, from that blank cursor, that blinking cursor, that may as well be the hourglass spinning or any one of those things staring at me in the computer that just is frightening as all get out. What are some steps that people can look at to be like, okay, here's where I need to start?
Okay, two things. First of all, you got to make sure it's an episode that's worth, like, that you can repurpose in that way, because I've definitely had episodes where, like, ours is a good example right now. You could do this, like, you could do like 10 tips to XYZ, right? But I've definitely had some episodes, and I'm sure you have too, where it's more just storytelling and it doesn't actually really make into a good value add blog. So like that's step one, is make sure you're working with something that actually can be repurposed. And step two, I like to use AI for this. So I will upload my episode into Otter AI. Or I'm sure there's other tools out there. Riverside probably has something of its own, and ask it to give me, like, can you give me the outline for a blog from this episode? I will not ask it to write it for me because I like to do that. But then I'll look through the transcript and kind of like match it up to the outline and see where I can turn that into a blog. Some people might have to take that a step further and say, can you write me a blog article from this podcast, and then put it into their own words. I would never encourage anybody to copy and paste what AI says.
No, because it's usually pretty obvious when someone does that. It is, to me, it's if there becomes a disconnect between what is said in the podcast and what is put on the blog, if it is just a copy and paste operation.
Yes. And you can kind of tell you're just doing it for like the keywords or just to have the blog there. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I love your outline approach to that, because now you're like, okay, look, here's 10 bullet points. These are the things that I need to write about. This is what was covered. And even then you can take and be like, okay, well, these 8 are all heavily associated with each other, and these other 2 were kind of, so I can toss. Yeah, no, I absolutely love that. One thing that you said, consistency doesn't equal frequency. I love your approach to that. Give me the background on that.
Okay, so the question you had asked me, or the question you raised, was like, how can we stay consistent in creating content? And I love consistent. I am the most consistent person. You know, it is for better or worse. But I will not be consistent. I will not commit to something that I know that I can't be consistent with. And to do that, I have to choose different frequencies. So let me give you like a example, because these are confusing words when you don't hear them in context. So like, I have a friend who I walk with every single week. That is our consistency. Like, we've made a goal to walk every week together. I have other friends that I might only see once a month, right? I don't beat myself up about only seeing them once a month, because that's our consistency. So when you're doing this with your content, same thing. Like, if you set out to do a weekly newsletter, that's your frequency. So you want to stick to that. If you're like, nope, I can actually only handle once a month, that's your frequency. So you want to stick to that. It's like, whatever you choose, make sure that you have the ability, the capacity to actually commit to it, and then stick with that. But that's the key, I think, to being consistent in the things you want, is choosing a realistic frequency for yourself.
How do you find that? Because we see, I get it all the time where, I talk to people like, I'm going to do a weekly podcast. And I'm like, no, you're not. I'm like, you're going to do, because we see it all the time too. It's that pod fade. 12, 14, 15 podcasts in. It's like, I think the number is now it's a flat 85. It was 86% of podcasts are dead before they hit episode 16. Right. So, what is a way that someone that you feel can find some of that consistency before they, let's say, try and run through the wall like the Kool-Aid man? Okay,
I love this. You can apply this to literally anything in your life. You could just do a life audit, or you could do like a marketing audit. So I will often have people look through everything that they've committed to with their marketing. And I mean everything, every chamber event that you are committed to, every organization that you're part of, everything you're sponsoring, anything that you do in your marketing, you write that down. And then you look at like, do I actually have the space to do another thing? And if so, how much space do I really have? And then like they would want to talk to someone like you or someone like me that knows how much time goes into this thing. Like I can tell you right now, an hour of content probably takes you, but between you and your team, it's like 4 hours. It's not just like, oh, boom, we posted it. It takes more time than you think it's going to take. So you have to look at those pieces too. But I like to do a marketing or life audit and just like dump everything out that I'm committed to. And if there's something on that list that you're like, oh, that should not be there, I could actually replace it with this podcast that I want to start, or I could replace it with posting more often on Instagram. It can come off the list once you see it all and you know exactly what you're committed to.
I love that audit piece. That to me is really cool because so many people don't know where their time goes.
So true.
you look at the end of the week and you're like, I mean, especially as a business owner, you're like, it's Friday.
I feel like I did something, but what was it?
Right. I have been busy all week. I have no clue what I got done, but I have been busy all week. Where did this time go? And people don't often enough, I think, look at that and have the realization of that. The other thing that I liked is what you said is that, it's 4 to 5 hours typically for us to have everything worked out, done through. And that does, I mean, I would say that includes the pre-production and post-production with that. And we do this every day, all the time. We're doing this 40, 50, 60 hours a week in some cases. We're pros at it. For someone that does this once or twice a month, it takes a whole heck of a lot longer. And so, finding that time. And it can work out great for some people because I know some people that spend a half an hour. They go on, they hit record, they cut the ends off, they post it, and they're like, great, whatever happens, happens.
Yeah.
They also realize what they're going to get from that. They're going to get mainly the conversation. They aren't going to get the knowledge or the traction, I guess I would say, that they would be looking for otherwise. You've, in a couple of cases here, you've emphasized audience first. What's one thing that a business can look at today to make sure that they are more audience centric in all of their content? Is your podcast not getting the results you hoped for? Are you feeling stuck and unsure how to grow your audience or make a real impact? We get it. Podcasting can be a challenge, but with the right strategies, it can be an incredibly powerful tool. That's why we're offering our free no-pitch podcast consultation. We'll spend 30 minutes with you identifying areas for improvement on anything from optimizing your audio or video quality to developing a content strategy that resonates with your customers. If you're ready to unleash your podcast's full potential, visit the link in our show notes to schedule your free consultation. Space is limited, so sign up today so we can help you create a podcast that truly shines.
I would say get on a call with your best customer and have a conversation with them and ask them why they chose you, what their problems were before working with you, and how they feel on the other side. Like if you can't think of what they're going through and what they're feeling and experiencing and what they can expect to be transformed in, have the conversation with them and ask them. And if you have a good client or customer, they will tell you. If you can't do that, get in a space where those people exist. And that could be like a Facebook group, that could be an in-person networking group, and talk to them. Like the only way to really understand how people feel is to actually understand it. So you have to ask them questions and talk to them and listen. And I think unfortunately, that's where like a lot of people go wrong. They just create what they want to create and not necessarily like what their customers need. So it's really, I do believe in creating what you love and what you want to create. You have to just kind of find that bridge of like, what do I like to do? And also what do they need? And where can I make those two things meet?
Yeah, I love that. We do get some people that, I mean, occasionally say, I'm going over here. And we're like, well, no one's over there.
Exactly.
They've told you they're not over there and they told you they're not going to follow you, but okay, sure. That being said, what's the best piece of advice you've ever received about being in business?
Okay, the best piece of advice I've ever received is I had a mentor when I had a mattress store before all of this. Long story for another day.
I was about to say that sounds like it could be a whole nother podcast.
Yeah, that's another story. So I had a mattress store and like I was doing all the things marketing wise and I was just beating my head against the wall. Like, why is this not, we had been in it for like 4.5 years and it kind of plateaued and I was getting really frustrated. And she's like, Emily, you literally have locked yourself in your store for 4.5 years. You need to go out and meet some people. Like, you need to go make some friends. And it wasn't like social friends. Like, at the time, I was trying to sell the business. Like, she wanted me to go meet like other business owners. And I did. And it was the best thing. I said yes to a lot of coffee chats. Not all of them went somewhere. I just met a ton of people. And in fact, just this morning, I had coffee with somebody I met through that experience, and we have now known each other for like 11.5 years. So it's like those kind of things that, again, you never know what possibility is on the other side, but you do, like, you have to get out a little bit and go meet and connect with other people.
It's funny you say that because I just had the conversation with one of our hosts earlier today. There's a certain connection that business owners have. It's the same thing with marketers. Yes. There's a connection there that it is we're not all in competition with each other. He has a car repair facility, a number of car repair facilities. He's like, there's plenty of cars for everyone to work on. His philosophy very much is we all need to talk. We need to help each other. There are things that business owners can talk about that when I talk with some of my friends that aren't business owners, they look at me like, what? And exactly. They just can't associate with that. When you're like, yeah, I've got to write a giant check to a number of people this week because they worked for me this week. It's a large check and I'm grateful for the fact that I get to pay my employees well. But when you're writing a check for that number at the end of the week, you're like, wow, that is a lot of money that I am just writing a check for. Yeah. And it's scary. So yeah, that ability to get out and to talk with others and to learn from others. I've always been a smart man learns from his mistakes. A wise man learns from the mistakes of others.
I so agree with you. And yeah, you're right. Like that, your family, they just don't really understand in the same way that another business owner does. I actually think my family still knows what I do. So there's that.
There's probably pros and cons to that.
Yes, exactly.
There's some things where you're like, this is a little scary and sketchy. I'm probably glad my family is not involved. Totally understand that. Everything that I've seen from your content's been very impressive. If there is a content creation tip that you could tell people, whether it be for video, photo, Instagram, writing, if there's one tip that you could give people on making sure that they are going to connect, what would that be?
Well, I think, again, I want to go back to being conversational because I think we think that when we are writing a post or we are doing a podcast, like we think we need to talk kind of like over people a little bit or like just broad, like we think of it as broadcasting. And it really, at the end of every single thing that you're doing, even if you are giving a presentation in a room full of 300 people, you are speaking to individuals in that room. So making it conversational and making it individualized, and don't be afraid to be specific, like to use really specific examples and really specific wording, because the specific actually, this is like a writing saying, not mine, but like the specific ends up being very, very universal. Like we all have shared a lot of these specific experiences. And so when we see them, we're like, oh, I totally get that. Like I feel that, right? So I think that's my 2-in-1 tip. Be conversational and don't be afraid to be specific.
I love that. I mean, that's why I love doing the podcast, because I get moments like this of just brutal clarity. Everyone in that audience is a specific person.
Yes.
You're not talking to the audience. You are talking to a bunch of individuals. That to me is huge. That's, I mean, totally huge. I absolutely love it. Is there anything that you think that we missed that you would like to cover real quick on that content side?
We went a lot of places, so I feel
did.
pretty good about everything we covered. Yeah, but thank you for asking.
Awesome. I am so grateful that you were able to come on. I really appreciate the time. Where can people find you?
The easiest place is emilyaborn.com because you can connect with me wherever you like to connect. I always say, like,
Love it.
Then you can find me where you hang out. And thank you, Josh, so much for having me. This was really fun, and you ask fantastic questions.
Thanks. Kind of what I do. I enjoyed this, and we'll have to do a follow-up here soon. Thanks for coming on, Emily. In summary, it was really great to have Emily on. Really, the big things that I got from this, listen to your audience. The podcast is just the beginning of the content. Listen to what your audience says. Listen to where they want you to go. Listen to what they want from you. That will help guide not only your podcast, but your business also. And the other part of that, make that personal connection. The example that she gave about the audience there, I'm still just overwhelmed by. You're not talking to a group of 300. You're talking to 300 individuals. Connect with those individuals. That, to me, is huge. The other piece with that is we talked about that frequency and consistency. Make sure you find that. Spend that time. Do that audit. Go in. Figure out what you can actually do. You're going to find it might be different than what you initially thought you could actually do. With that, please do me a favor. Give us a review on your podcasting platform. Would help us immensely, especially if you think this is worth it to share it with someone else. Leave a comment, like, share, all those other things. We would love to hear from you. We want you to guide the content that's coming up here. We're taking Emily's advice in this. As always, take care of yourself, and if you can, take care of someone else too. I will see you very soon. Creating engaging content can feel overwhelming, but it doesn't have to be. That's why I'm excited to share our Stomping Podcasting newsletter. You'll get actionable insights and expert tips straight to your inbox. These are to help you maximize your video marketing and podcasting return on investment. Head over to the show notes and click the link to subscribe to our free newsletter. Don't miss out on this opportunity to become a video marketing and podcasting pro.